institutional racism embedded in the culture of psychiatry and psychology is derived from Western culture. I think we all agree on that. But institutions, we often think of bricks and mortar. It's actually us. It's our institutions are the people who run them. Notes about race and racism can be traced in Western culture from very early Middle Ages. Now, a quick rundown on the history of how race came about, how it was invented. Notions of race derives from othering plus race thinking. And according to Fanon, race is actually beyond the other. Othering, so others are there, and race is the racist. Racialization is beyond the other, to dehumanizing. Now, race was originally defined by nominal religion. Mainly Jews and Muslims were traditionally, in the olden days, were the other who did not belong. Pogroms, expulsions, persecutions, we know about that. We've heard quite a lot about it recently too. Now, that meant that the external appearance of the human body was only a part of it. Religion played a part. There were various other factors which went into thinking of people in terms of a race. But race slavery and race-based colonialism, that's the Atlantic slave trade, changed that very fundamentally. White supremacy implied the opposite, which is black subservience and inferiority. Black and white were one against the other, as it were. External appearance again alone now defined race, and we call it biological racism. And 19th century science justified the variety, black, brown, yellow, red, and so on, headed by white, of course, and various other divisions. But the color divisions were the sort of predominated in our thinking. So race and racism became the norm in Western culture. So that carried on for years and years. Race thinking, racism's culture of history of the West too. Right up to the Second World War. After the end of World War II, but perhaps because of the exposure of the Jewish Holocaust, and I think more significantly almost, the fall of European empires, one by one, French, British, Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese, they all fell. And of course, by then, the American in the Philippines, etc. And there was a partial appraisal at the end of the war about the whole business, what had been going on for years and years, about colonialism particularly. And the UN was created, the WHO was created. It was in a way to try and retrieve the past. And race was recognized by the UN as not a valid scientific category, never had been, for dividing up human beings. Overt racist behavior then diminished. There was political correctness. We didn't talk about it very much. We put it into the unconscious, you might say, psychologists might say. Racism, I say, went underground. Subtle institutional racism, as Stokely Carmichael described, thrived in the cultures of the West. And then this culture spread worldwide, all over. We are all affected by Western culture now. We are all, to quite a varying extent, but we are all affected by these ideas and these institutional problems. 1990s onwards, there was then gradually the new racism, as we called it. The social scientists in Britain called them the new racism, cultural, institutional, subtle, going right up to racism without racists, racism without obvious racists. Everyone saying, I'm not racist, I'm uttering the most racist remarks. And this was associated with the cultural definition of race. Today, institutional racism is the norm, the power base of the master's house, providing the energy for overt acts of racism. Whenever there is any crisis, up comes racism, overt actions. Black people, Jews, others are persecuted or thrown out. Racism is about power, not a problem of immorality or of ignorance, of not knowing, but what the other races are like. And Kendi's work is now transformative work, I think, that came out a couple of years ago. The definition of race now, social race, this is from American book, but very applicable all over the world, I think. Race is a concept that signifies and symbolizes social conflict and interests, capitalist interests often, by it's the power, by referring to different types of human bodies. That plays a significant part still, the way you look. The study of racial and later cultural differences in rates of diagnosing mental illness has a long history in Western psychiatry. That's what we are concerned about in this webinar. Question almost from the very beginning of psychiatry was, do Black people have go mad more easily, have greater insanity when compared to white people? It goes right back to the 17th, 16th centuries. Three theories emerged over the years, hundreds of years. First, savages. Black people are savages. They are often described as savages. Savages, that's why I put it in inverted commas. Savages are not civilized, so they have less insanity. It's a noble savage, as Rousseau put it. And that was a very popular theme in the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s. Maudsley, Esquirol, great new names in psychiatry supported this. Second theory was savages, Black people, lack civilization, so they are mentally degenerate anyway. We can't really recognize madness because they are degenerate. Degeneracy was seen at that time in the 19th century, 20th century even, as the basis of madness. And in the USA, a slightly different, a more complicated version turned up. You got low rates of insanity if you're in slavery, if you're a slave, if you're enslaved. But if you're set free, manage to get away, it's high. You keep breaking down and you're admitted to mental hospitals or deported. And today we have these statistics appearing in our journals, psychiatric and medical journals. Diagnosis schizophrenic, compulsory detained, offender patient, the mad and bad, you go into special hospitals. Held by the police under section 136, transferred to locked wards from open wards, not referred for talking therapies. When they are, they often felt that they don't make any sense really, all these talking therapies. They seem to ignore the Black presence. Initially, these differences were attributed to their cultures, typical blaming the victims. Then to discrimination in society. Not me, psychiatrists say, I have nothing to do with me. I just make the diagnosis. And that's what the president of the college now says too, that we are trying to help people who have suffered racism. We are not doing anything to them. We are not racist. We meaning the psychiatric fraternity or psychiatric system. But experiences and studies, social historical perspectives, quite clearly show that the cause is institutional racism in the master's house. Inequalities are what is done to people through one group exercising power over others, racial inequalities. But why do we say it's institutional and not just acts of racial other forms of discrimination? Well, when there is a pattern of inequalities in various fields in the same society affecting negatively a particular racial group, this is a racial event. That's what McPherson said in his report on Stephen Lawrence inquiry. Slightly different context, but that's what he said. So if you think about sectioning, schizophrenia label, stop and search, school exclusions, prison rates, university admissions, unemployment, illegal expulsions for non-citizenship, etc., one group, it always is on the wrong side, is the other victims. So all these research by psychiatrists and epidemiologists and clinical psychologists in our journals has not revealed the cause of racial inequalities. And that's repeated time and again. in the present psychiatric journals. Medical type research using Eurocentric psychiatric illness models, they cannot research race and racism. It's not a medical issue. It's actually one of social power. It's a power phenomenon. Focus on individuals' culture. Now, what exactly is my culture? I don't know. You know, there are sorts of mixtures I've been through. I've got sorts of funny names from all sorts of places. I've got habits. And it's hybrid. We're all hybrid in a way. And this avoids considering race and racism. We keep dividing people into cultures for this research. Race equality approach using medical diagnosis sidesteps racism, which is a power construct. It's not a medical construct. Research into race, social power concept needs to take on board, firstly, I think the experience of the victimized. And I heard this when I was working, and that's what made me think, I think very first time, asked a black guy why he thought he was being sectioned, and he said, well, it's like slavery talk, isn't it? And when you think about it, actually it is. Let me carry out socio-historical explanations, explore narratives, backstories of what really happens when the research is done, what really goes on behind the scenes, and when diagnoses are made. History can tell us a lot too. For example, look at the overall history. I won't go into the details, obviously. Here it's complicated, but take this away, look at it if you haven't seen this sort of diagram. Here, psychiatry and psychology arose in a time of slavery and colonialism, when racism, very brutal racism, was the norm. And it would have been very surprising if it didn't come up with being racist. Few examples. Stanley Hall was the leading psychologist in the States. And he published his first book. He was an expert on adolescence, was Adolescent Races. And that's the first time there was a chapter about us, Indians, Africans, North American Aborigines, and those were the three groups mentioned particularly. These were adolescent races. The rest was about white people who are in adolescence age groups. Kraepelin, the great Kraepelin, he went to Sri Lanka and Java. He came back and said, well, they don't get depressed or suffer from guilt, these Asian people. They're psychically underdeveloped. And that was in textbooks then, because Kraepelin said it. Carl Jung went to America, and he didn't like what he saw in America. The white Americans waving their arms about and saying all sorts of peculiar things that he thought were not typical of white people, because they were white people and they were different to the Swiss who he knew in Switzerland. And he said they were suffering from racial infection. Race was infecting them because they lived too close and they ought to be separated. Carruthers, leucotomized Europeans, he was invited by the WHO to do a report on Black people's psychiatry, Black people's mental health rather. And one of his, he has big journal report. One thing he said was that they actually were like leucotomized Europeans, people who had brain damage inflicted by surgeons to leucotomy that was done for psychiatric illnesses. And so on and so on. And then of course the low IQ of Black people gets repeated even now. When I first came to England as a student in the 1950s, I was told that I was Black. And Black race became a part of my identity. It's now questioned. Said, you're not Black, you're brown, you're not African, so you can't be Black, etc., etc. But that's what I was told when I came, and that stuck with me. I studied race as it appeared in the mental health system. I now know that James Baldwin was right. It's all about power. History is not the past. It is the present. We are our history. The world is not white. It never was white. White is a metaphor for power. And finally, perhaps to lighten our moods a little bit. The world is not white.
Your father is an African. Your mother may be Norwegian. You pass me, you wouldn't say goodnight. Feeling you are really white. Your skin may be a little pink, and that's the reason why you think that the complexion of your face can hide you from the Negro race. No, you can never get away from the fact. If you're not white, you consider black. You jog along the thoroughfare, you shake your waist like Fred Astaire, and when you see me passing by, you watch me with a crooked eye. And yet you speak to Mr. B, who does not want your company. In every way you endeavor to show yourself superior. No, you can never get away from the fact. If you're not white, you consider black. Your Negro here is obvious. You make it more conspicuous. You use all sorts of Vaseline to make out you are European. You speak with exaggeration to make the greatest impression that you were taught apparently at Cambridge University. No, you can never get away from the fact. If you're not white, you consider black.
Just one more verse.
You hate the name of Africa, the land of your great-grandfather, the country where you can't be wrong, the home where you really belong. You rather be among the whites than stick up for your father's rights, and very often from your face to think you're from the Negro race. No, you can never get away from the fact. If you're not white, you consider black.
Thank you.